Welcome to SPAU 25. This is the Trust in the Digital Society event, and I am super excited to be in a live company of a group of wonderful people I'm going to introduce in a moment. My name is Balázs Bodó. I'm an associate professor at the Institute for Information Law, University of Amsterdam, and with my colleague Elaine Johnson here, we are working on a research project that ultimately stumbled upon the question of trust, government, society, and digital technologies. And we convened this panel to actually try to learn a little bit more about what happens when various governments start to rely on various digital technological infrastructures of unknown trustworthiness. I'm going to introduce the topic in a moment in more detail, but first I would like to introduce the panel. From left to right in my screen. It is Elaine Johnson, who is a research scientist with us at the Institute for Information Law, and she does a lot of work on data governance, but also the role of government on trustworthy data infrastructures. Next to him, it is Gemma Diamond, who is a senior policy advisor of emerging technologies and human rights at the Dutch Ministry of Interior. And he is also the national representative at the European Blockchain Partnership, which is also part of our research interest at the university. Next to him, it is Leontien Weseling-Löber. She works for the Dutch Council of State as the section head or sector head for the advisory division of the Council of the State. And last but not least, Stephen Haywood is the CEO of Edelman Amsterdam, a research and PR firm notable for the Edelman Trust Barometer, which surveys trust in public institutions and in various technologies regularly, and has some really interesting empirical data on the dynamics of trust. With that, I would like to welcome you again and show a little bit of the context for you, why we think this topic is important. Well, at least in the Netherlands, trust has been popping up with increasing frequency in various government documents, in the 2017 coalition agreement, but also in the jaarverslag of the Council of State. And it's also mentioned in various regulatory proposals, both by the European Commission and also by various Dutch legal documents. To understand why that is, maybe we need to understand a little bit how we define trust, or why we think trust is a key ingredient in the digital society. First of all, we need probably trust to actually engage with each other, or engage with strangers across very large, often linguistic, cultural, geographic distances. We need that type of resource or ingredient to be able to live in the same society, or just buy something on the internet, or learn something from each other. If trust is something, if you think of trust as a resource, then we can also think about how it is being produced. It has certain components, like we are more likely to trust another person if we share the same background, or we are sharing some cultural traits or social traits together. We are more likely to trust another if we can somehow control the risks that an engagement carries. If you can enter into a contract, it's much easier to trust a stranger. And it's also easier to trust if you can buy some insurance against the risk that the trust relationship carries inherently. Now, these things, familiarity, control, and insurance, can be rooted in many things. It can be rooted in communal networks, organized around shared past or shared history, or maybe shared ethnicities, shared religion, shared professional backgrounds. But it can be also be rooted in shared epistemic frameworks, which are not always good. And we see that in the case of conspiracy networks, when people convince each other that wearing masks is not a good thing, or being vaccinated is not a good thing. These are very communal or sometimes tribal sources of information and tribal sources of trust as well. In contrast, when we live in a society, whether that's a city or whether that's a nation state, we also rely on more institutionalized forms of trust provided as a public service by the nation state. When our children are in the same school, they are learning the same curriculum, then they learn to trust each other more easily, even if they are from a very different background. The NOS, the public service media, plays a very important role in maintaining social cohesion and creating that shared understanding of what's happening in the society. But also public administration plays a crucial role through their fair, transparent, accountable practices to make sure that one citizen can trust the other citizen can trust the government, and also the government can trust the citizen. And ultimately, trust is also a private good, which can be bought and sold on the market. Lawyers, accountants are actually selling trust on the marketplace. You can buy trust from them. Also, commercial brands, probably Stephen's very familiar with, are sources of trust that make sure that you can sit in a car or buy a hamburger and you get the same service across the globe. What is strange, and this is the apropos of this discussion, is that more and more we are interacting with or interacting with each other through technologies which are also private trust infrastructures, if you like. The most obvious example would be Airbnb and Uber, which allow you to violate the first rule that every parent teaches to their child, is don't sit in a stranger's car and don't sleep in a stranger's bed. These are technologies, apps, mobile technologies, centralized private infrastructures which allow us to actually trust a stranger. But other technologies also have this same function, like blockchain technologies allow you to interact without needing to trust, without having any kind of information on the other's trustworthiness or reputation. And increasingly, AI systems and machine learning systems also help us trust certain types of information more than others, or help us make certain decisions with better luck than others. They reduce future uncertainty, and with that, they delineate a supposedly more trustworthy space of alternatives for everyone involved. Now the question is, what happens with the society when these three sources of trust, the communal trust logics, the private trust logics, and the public trust logics start to be upset? The status quo is being upset. And I'd like to bring you a small case study, which is, for me, the most contentious issue nowadays, and that starts with the public trust being challenged, and maybe Stephen will talk about that later, is that we see that trust in public institutions and trust in government is under siege, or it's being challenged. It's breaking down in many parts of in the world, and that's not a real surprise, if you like. Nation states face problems that they are not best equipped to solve. These are mostly global challenges. The pandemic is the prime example here. And we see also technology disruption. And this disruption is, in fact, or difficulties to deal with the world as if nothing has happened, right? The disruption actually is about to make sure that the status quo is not there anymore. Now, people react differently to the loss of trust in public institutions. The National Intelligence Council of the United States has warned that as the trust in public institutions break down, these communal trust networks start to fill in the gap, right? And people turn to each other for trust. And sometimes these communal trust or tribal trust networks are not for the society, they are for each other. And sometimes they can be very misguided if we, again, take a look at conspiracy networks. And this threatens with the fragmentation of society and the breakdown of society into smaller groups, which often find very hard to communicate with each other across those divisions. Now, what I see is that the state doesn't sit idle, and maybe both Leontine and Shem will be able to tell us how that works in practice. But the state reacts, right? And they sometimes by their own choice, sometimes due to certain pressures, involve digital technologies to overcome the trust problem. Police turns to AI to have a better predictive policing logic. In the times of crisis, such as what we face now, schools turn to remote education and involve Google Classroom or Microsoft Teams or a number of e-learning platforms to provide their own core function of education. Public health officials turn to AI system diagnosing certain illnesses, or they just put another technology into our bodies, which is a vaccine, right? Public administrators turn to systems that they hope to help them detect fraud better, or better be more efficient in public administration. And Helen maybe will tell us a little bit more about how that logic takes place. So the governments start to incorporate more and more digital technologies in their processes, but these technologies are not always trustworthy, right? They are new, they are untested, they are offered by private companies who do not have the societies or individual citizens' best interest at mind, which is also their nature. So that's nothing surprising there. But still, the challenge here is what I see, and maybe you'll agree, maybe you'll disagree, is that more and more of these digital technologies we use or we rely on, or we are forced to rely on, are of dubious or unknown trustworthiness. And when they backfire, and they do backfire sometimes, they do not deliver what they promise to do, or they introduce horrible racial or other biases into public administration, and the Dutch near past has been very rich in such problems, such as the Toeslagen affair or the Syria case. Then what is at stake is the very trust in the government that we have been starting with. And that might turn into a very nasty, vicious circle where we started with a challenged trust in public institutions, and we end up with more challenge. Because ultimately what drives citizen trust in their government is the quality of public services and social cohesion, and digital technologies threaten to break down both. So the question for this panel and for today is, how can we stop this vicious circle, maybe? What can we do to actually strengthen or maintain trust in public institutions, especially in the Netherlands, where this initial trust is relatively high? And how can we make those technologies that we are forced to rely on more trustworthy? What are the procedures? What are the administrative, legal, but also social ways to actually maintain trust in societies through maintaining trust in technologies and in the government? With that, I would like to welcome the audience. That we do not see all of them. And I would like to hand over the floor to the panel, whom I asked to introduce themselves briefly and bring forward a statement or a provocation or something from their background which is relevant to the topic.
Great. Thank you very much for the introduction. My name is Steve Hayward. I'm the CEO of Edelman Amsterdam. Edelman is a communications consultancy, and our purpose is to help build trust between brands and society. We've been doing a piece of research, the Edelman Trust Barometer, for 21 years now. The great thing about doing something for 21 years is you start to get an idea about what might be a one-off, a bit of a blip in the data, and what might be something that's a kind of sustainable trend that you can pretty much bank on. You can hang your hat on that. That's going to be something we can kind of work with. Of course, maybe that's a bit easier when you're not in the middle of a pandemic and such a volatile environment. But the good news is we've been doing quite a lot of additional research over the last 18 months. So we do start to see some trends within the pandemic, as well as some sort of broader societal trends. And I'll try and connect the dots between both of those today. First, as you mentioned, we're zooming into the Netherlands today. We're here in Amsterdam on a lovely day. And the Netherlands is quite an interesting country because geographically, you locate it right next to Germany, kind of near Belgium and France. But when you look at the Edelman Trust Barometer, that really doesn't seem where it sits at all. It's a much higher trust country. It starts at a much higher baseline trust than almost any one of its neighbours. And it's kind of closer to somewhere like Singapore than it is to somewhere like Germany when it comes to levels of public trust in institutions. And at Edelman, we look at trust in 4 institutions: government, business, NGOs, and the media. And you see that's kind of a consistent trend for well over a decade now, that the Dutch have a relatively high level of trust. So I guess I start there with some of the good news. I think when it comes to the other panelists and when it comes to Dutch society, I very quickly move on to much less good news, which is when we go back to spring of last year, we did a special report for the Trust Barometer to understand what was happening in the pandemic. And perhaps it's almost counterintuitive, but what you saw at the start was the Dutch, in common with many other countries, were putting even more trust in government. Now, unfortunately for us, kind of fortunately for Edelman, because we predicted this, that trust bubble completely burst. We've seen over the last 12 months that high level of trust that was placed in government at the start of the pandemic has dropped away. You saw a double-digit increase in trust in government in almost every country, including our near neighbours who normally have a slightly lower level of trust. What you see now in the latest research we've done is that's completely collapsed away, and government is no longer a trusted institution in most countries. In the Netherlands, it's still kind of clinging on to trust because we define it quite tightly, and it's sort of just there, but not really compared to anywhere where it should have been if you look back over the last 12 months. Well, where's that trust gone? Predominantly it's gone to business, and actually business has become the most trusted institution during that period. I think that's really interesting. You can also then dive into that a bit further. When you kind of double click on that and say, well, where in business is that trust? It's still not great news for business either. So a lot of that trust is with people that are very immediate to you. So it's with colleagues, it's with the CEO of your own company, it's with your own employer. It's not with business as an overall institution either. So you can really say that all 4 of the institutions are struggling to find their place and to find their kind of role and purpose within building trust. So I guess that's my first piece of news to bring today, is around the state of trust in the Netherlands and particularly towards government as an institution. I did want to just briefly talk about what we mean by trust in our kind of research context. And we kind of simplify it to look at trust through 2 main lenses. The first of which is competence, and the second is ethics. What we mean by that, competence is that you have the ability to do the right thing, and ethics is you have the will to do the right thing. So we look at trust through those domains, and then we plot the different institutions on those domains. And what you see is, whilst business kind of just about hovers in that quadrant of being seen as trusted and seen as able to do the right thing and willing to do the right thing, you do see that in the Netherlands, government, again, it's not great, but it's not so bad. It doesn't have too far to go to get somewhere close to that kind of elusive quadrant of both able and willing to do the right thing. In many markets, you see that government really has a kind of execution problem. It's not trusted to do the right thing, but it also knows no sort of trust that it's willing to do the right thing either. So in Netherlands, you don't really see that so much. It does have this pretty classic problem of a bit of a problem with kind of competence. People don't necessarily think it can do the right thing, but it doesn't have such a hill to climb. So I guess, again, that's something quite positive we can take from this, that there is a hill to get over. Another area I just wanted to briefly touch on was technology. It's definitely the topic of the day. Technology, again, is a bit of a strange one. It's been an institution or a sector that's been quite well trusted over time. But yeah, as with many areas, when you kind of probe that a bit further, some of that trust does fall away. So what you see is that in the last 12 months, particularly, technology, which probably should have had a real kind of good time with trust, doesn't seem to have leveraged the gains that we hoped during that period. You also see that specific forms of technology don't do so well. And again, one of those long-term trends I would connect this to, for a very long time now in the Trust Barometer, we've seen significant signs that society feel technology is moving too fast. There's extremely strong responses to the question, to the pace of change in technology is too fast. This is something that comes back again and again in the Trust Barometer. And I think the question there is, what has changed over the last 12 months where we've all had to work really fast to adopt new technologies? Is this an opportunity, or is that actually going to make things worse? Those are a few facts around how trust stands today. That's kind of what I wanted to share at the start. I'm sure there's much more to dig into, and particularly about the response to how we build trust within society and how government builds trust in the Netherlands. So I'll leave it for there for now and look forward to debating it a bit further.
Thank you very much. The very similar issues about government competence and government goodwill has been the major topic of the Dutch Council of State's yearly report from last year, which has focused on this very topic. Right, the trust was in the headlines or in the title of that jaarverslag, and I'm curious how the thinking went through that organization or through that document, because the document had two major focus: the jaarverslag, which dominated the toeslagen affair, which dominated the discussions in internal politics in the Netherlands for quite some time now, which was about, I don't know, was it about the goodwill or was it about the capacity? But also this problem that also Stephen highlighted, that actually there is a very strong bond, trust bond between the government and the citizen, not just one way that the citizen trusts the government, but also the other way, whether the government trusts the citizen. So I wonder how that works out. How that worked out within the organization, and how, because the jaarverslag didn't really talk about technologies per se, but how technologies come into the picture when we look beyond the administrative, procedural, institutional questions.
Thank you very much. Yeah, at the Council of State we have two divisions. I think it's good to clarify that for the audience. You have the advisory division, which is an independent body which advises the government on all changes in legislation. And then we have the judicial body who does the administrative rulings. And I work for the advisory division. There's a separation within the organization. But the jaarverslag is a joint publication. So that's also why there was a lot of focus on the toeslagenaffaire, because, well, one of the problems was that the judges were faced with a law that said, no matter what happens, this is fraud, and you had no wiggling room to say, well, in this case, there's clearly no fraud. So that's one of the issues that I think also ties it in with the technology, because we expect a lot from our government, and we've been starting to expect more and more and more from our government as citizens. If you look at the original state, it was meant to keep you safe. It was trying to police people and try to prevent violence. But over the years, we've been adding the whole welfare system. We've been adding the tax system. We've been adding the housing system. And to be honest, we cannot do that anymore without technology. If you try to address 17 million citizens in the Netherlands by paper-based systems, it's not doable. So even for just efficiency reasons, you have to move towards technology, towards systems. And I don't want to say it wasn't a big problem, but I think the focus is so much on the cases that went wrong that we tend to forget that most of it goes okay. If you look at the way we do our taxes now online, and everything is pre-filled and everything is ready for you, it's a lot easier nowadays to do your taxes than it was 5 or 10 years ago. And in 95% of the cases, that goes without a hitch. But that's not media worthy. So I think we should also, as a society, be aware of that trust is something different than the feeling of trust. So maybe a system, if you look at the specs, if you look at the stuff, the system itself, it can be made in a way that, in a technological sense of the word, it can be trusted. But that's something different than that people actually trust it. And I think with the very rapid introduction of lots of systems that people don't understand anymore, because, like you said, one of the things that increases trust if you understand what's going on. And with most of these systems, we don't know what's going on. And then if somebody says, well, a mistake was made in my case, then you think, oh, maybe a mistake was made in my case, but I'm not sure how to check that, because I don't know how the system works. I'm not sure who is responsible for the system in the end. What we also notice with the council is that we see a tendency, most ministries are still, if you look at the people that work there, they're still lawyers, they're political scientists, they're policymakers. They're not necessarily the people that will understand how IT works, how a system works. So there's a tendency in the legislation to say, well, those are technical issues, we'll put them in the lowest level of legislation because they need to change them very often. But that also means they kind of fade away from the public debate that's being held in the parliament when the legislation is put in place. Because if you look at the bigger pieces of legislation that deal with digital issues, the law itself doesn't really say anything about the digital issues. It's all delegated towards lower legislation, which means the parliament, when adopting the law, doesn't discuss this. And then it doesn't come into this discussion until the point where there's so many complaints about problems, then it's then discussed, but that's already too late. And then it's causing lack of trust with the citizens because they think, well, this was introduced, it was used 5 or 10 years, why wasn't that discussion being held earlier? So that's one of the reasons why the Council in 2018 published an advice about digitalization, where we said you really have to get those organizations that actually deal with that process of putting the law into a system, which is not just a simple question. Transferring legal language into digital yes or no, ones and zeros, is very, very difficult. I think it's a new topic that we haven't had. We don't have a study for that. We don't have an educational career where you learn how to transfer a piece of legislation into a computer system. And I think that's something that we as a country should focus on, because I think that's becoming more and more important. And one of the areas that I study in particular is the digitalization of election procedures, because that's also something that a lot of countries are looking into. And in the Netherlands, we had voting machines up to 2006, and they were black boxes. And basically nobody but the manufacturer knew what was happening inside the machine. And it was trusted. I mean, we introduced it in the 1960s, and 88% of the people in the Netherlands in 2006 said they trusted the system, even when it was hacked on national television 3 weeks before the election. And then we changed back to paper-based system because the parliament said, well, if somebody can hack it, then maybe we should not use it. And we've been using paper ballot voting since then. And I have some data which I found interesting from the 2017 national elections. And if you look at, I asked the question, what kind of voting method would you prefer? And if you look, the dark green is paper-based voting, and then the light green is voting computers, the yellow is mail voting, and the orange is internet voting. Then the majority of the voters in the Netherlands say, well, we prefer voting in person on paper in the ballot station. This was 2017. And then if you ask them, what method do you trust the most, then even a larger portion, almost a little bit more, over the 2/3 of the population say, well, we trust the paper ballot system the most, even though some prefer a system that they will trust less. But if you look at the debates in Parliament at that time, the debate was going on is why aren't we using internet voting for our elections, whereas only 6.8% of the population at that time say they trust that system. And then there's also a tendency to think that this is an age problem. So, well, if the older people, they're having the most difficulty with it, and so they will probably don't trust it because they don't know it. So we also looked at the age factor. And if you look at that, then the younger voters between 18 and 24 are the biggest group saying we prefer paper ballot voting. And even if you look at the question of trust, the difference becomes even higher. And they are the group that says we trust the paper systems more than we trust the digital systems. And there is a tendency, even though you have these numbers and you have the data, there's still a tendency for governments to push towards the machines, towards the systems, because they think it might be more efficient, it might be more innovative. But then you lose these people that say, we don't want that because we don't trust it. So I think with every process of digitalization, we shouldn't not do it because it's impossible to run nowadays society without. But we should really put the question in the foreground, are we doing this because it's necessary and because it has a lot of benefits, or are we doing it because we think it's newer, it's more modern, and our citizens would want it?
Thank you very much. These are super interesting questions. And for the last few questions, I think Elaine will address some of these questions last. But before that, I would like to ask Shem to actually chip in and introduce himself, because I think some of the discussions around whether it's a good idea to use an emerging technology goes on within that part of the government where you're situated at the Ministry of Interior. Looking at emerging technologies, and I'm really curious about the type of discussions that you are having there and the type of challenges that these discussions face within the body of the state.
Yes, so my name is Gemma Diamond. I'm a senior policy officer at the Ministry of Interior. I work at the cluster New Technologies, Human Rights and Public Values. And within our cluster, we work on various tools, policy matters, legislation regarding new technologies. So for instance, we work on children's rights in a digital environment. We do many public-private collaborations where we experiment with new technologies such as blockchain. But also, like you mentioned, in the international setting, we are also doing some kind of collaboration with other countries working on new technologies in order to enhance and make our public services better and more trustworthy. And I understand the notion that trust in governments, battery empty. Yeah. Hello? Yeah. I understand the notion that trust is getting less at government level. But I don't think it is a long-term thing, because if we look back for ages, it's always short-term notice. As long as a government keeps consistent doing whatever it did for decades before, sooner or later that trust always comes back. And that's also what we do with the new technologies. We're just tipping our toes. We are not going all in. We're trying to see what benefits a government can have with these new technologies. We tip our toe, like now it's summer, so when you want to go to the sea, you first tip your toe and then go all in. But the government will never go all in, I guess, with these new kind of technologies. Because trust, like the Dutch saying, comes by foot, but goes by horse. So once it's gone, it can take ages to come back. So we will see and try what benefits this technology can bring, and we can implement it to make our ministry, our government, more trustworthy. But I don't think we will always, all the time go all in with these new technologies, such as blockchain, such as AI. That's why we see many times the human control always coming back in procedures like when a judge does something or information decisions has been made, there always has to be a public servant looking at it. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I have some questions for you later, but as an introduction, that's perfect. Elaine, you have been researching some of the drivers where actually the government goes full in. I think with the voting machines, that has happened. It has happened with distance education. So there are instances where some bodies, some parts of the public sector embraces a technology, and it's very interesting to learn more about like how that happens, why that is, and when it's justified or not. Elaine.
Thank you so much, Palas, and thank you also the other participants. I can almost say there's not too much left to say for me, but there's so much to respond to. My name is Elaine Johnson. I've been working as of November last year for the University of Amsterdam in the group of Balázs, focusing on data governance in a broad sense. I haven't been busy with the data and new technologies for the past year. I've been busy with it as of 2006. I was working for the government for a long time, for the Ministry of the Interior. So I can say Sam is my successor, more or less. But I've always had my heart beating also on the scientific side of things. And that's how I always perceive my work as well. I try to red flag things. I wrote reports, I did advisory work. Well, there's a lot of experience I can tell from, but my scientific point of view is that I take a sort of looking at the trust that a government seeks to create, seeks to maintain, seeks to regain. That is an awful lot of work, particularly also where technology comes in. A lot has already been said, but having this long-standing experience in government, I think it's worth to zoom out and to look a little bit further back at things. And this is where you say, for instance, what has government done over the past 50 or 40 years? And you see that in the 1970s, 80s particularly, this whole new public management movement came in from the UK, from the United States, where it started with the Reagan government. And what it means is that government should be dealt with as a company, or more or less. It means mean and lean, efficient, money saving, cost saving, do things fast, metrics, everything had to be measured. Well, that is all by itself not a bad thing. But what we've seen is that the move towards making these things prime over what a government is here for on the world, what legitimizes its existence, that has shifted back. And of course, we saw the bad outcomes of this, but what we still see nowadays is that, that's my own experience as well, is that cost saving and efficiency are still very high on the agenda, and much policy is being shaped from that background. You see that the government itself is shaped by that background, because, well, a lot of experience and knowledge, yeah, I think there's a shortage in it. And of course, that is generally the case with technologies. So there's not so much demand for people with expertise in these areas. That's a big thing for government. It's also a big thing for companies to get the right people there. But there's a lot of, and Leontine already mentioned that very nicely, there's a lot of things to consider here rather than only focusing on these technologies. Well, I'm looking particularly at, well, what are the good intentions of government to start using those new technologies? Well, these new technologies, they properly they further drive the use of technology for mean and lean approaches of policy making, of legislation. And governments, yeah, they do want, in order to gain trust, they do want to take proper decisions, avoid arbitrary decisions, and they want to offer their citizens the best service that they can think of. But the point is that with these new technologies, we have seen some very bad outcomes, and I agree. So there are these are much zoomed in the media, in politics as well. But I think, yeah, I'm trying to scale and to sort out a sort of what are the drivers for these bad outcomes with the use of technology by governments. And I think they are not all very new, but they are more particular maybe for the government, such as, well, what choices are made for the performance indicators? And this is very challenging, and this sits very much in the technology itself. So you cannot use AI for everything. I mean, you must be known, you must be aware of what risks particularly AI can bring, or automated decision making. That was the Systems Risk Index that was, I think, particular for automated decision making. What you also see is that there's some sort of non-sensitivity for parameters. So if you look, these are more external factors towards how a technology is used. And what I find striking is the trust by government in commercial systems, or they let commercial parties build systems. I think that is really something to really distrust as a citizen, I think. So what you see is a sort of absence of ecosystem awareness of where such a technology is going to function. And I'm aware that the government has already said, well, when we buy in stuff from a private actor, we must have access to the system. But there are so many challenges coming with that, particularly for people who have to work with it. So if you say, well, we put human intervention behind it, who is going to guarantee me that these people are not saying, I don't understand the system, and I don't have time to understand the system. So you can say, is such a civil servant lazy? No, he isn't. He is tasked with a difficult thing, and he has to take decisions, let's say 60 minutes, 60 decisions in an hour. So he hasn't simply not much time to take a right decision or to really interrogate what the system has spit out. Then there are these technologist beliefs. I think they are great and very much present also. And that is what happens when you put technology right at the center of your policy making. And I think, yeah, I personally say that is not a good approach, because I think as a government, you are there, you were democratically elected to carry out certain tasks. And the task is not to create a technology or to work with a technology. Your task is to be a good minister of health, or to create a good education system, to have a vision on education. And perhaps technology can play a role, but we are not sure whether it can. So I spoke to Kathy O'Neill 2 or 3 weeks ago, and she said, before anything happens with technology, people start to talk to each other and say, what do we want to achieve? Discuss that out, try to you have to map all the difficulties and challenges that come with a certain policy, and you haven't started, you haven't even touched on technology. And once you have carved out what the risks of a certain policy or a certain law are, then you might invite the technologists at the table and together decide what the next steps are and whether technology could potentially play a role. So, according to me, there should always be an option for the government to say, we are not going to use the technology, but because the risks are too great. And they shouldn't forget that technology is extremely high risk. Is extremely high maintenance. So it sounds sexy to say here, from a tech solutionist belief, I want to use the technology for the COVID-19 app. I mean, at the time I was working in the government, I found that extremely problematic, how the things went. We were confronted with this proposal. It wasn't thought out from front to back. The whole ecosystem in which that COVID app had to function, that was complete riddle. So if you then say, here is a COVID app, these are the consequences. We are going to quarantine people. We have to close businesses. So the whole country is locked down. It is so incredibly important that you convince people where you are taking them and what the place of that particular app is in the whole system. And I tried, back then we tried to interrogate the people who were designing these apps, but they were very much ahead of us because we were seen as the people putting a fork in the road and saying, well, we are not going to do this. Well, I can tell you, this isn't cool in this time where technology is always envisioned as something. It's future. You want to go forward, and people asking critical questions, they are sometimes considered as, well, yeah, okay, we will solve that problem at some point. But no, you have to solve the problem right in front of, before you start using the technology. That is why impact assessments will become incredibly important. I know the government, the Ministry of the Interior is working on a fundamental rights impact assessment. And I hope to really soon see that. But these are really things that it's just one example. But I think we have to start a new discussion with each other and in different settings. So I leave it to that.
Great, thank you very much. I would like to continue on this thread because I see that there is a, on the one hand, there is this tech enthusiasm, and I don't know if Stephen can confirm what are the public attitudes towards trust in technology, but also there is a need for some kind of a competence to actually verify that or question that or resist that, and I don't know if how that competence can be built within the government, or how can it not be outsourced with the technology itself. So maybe if you can address this.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's a great amount to unpack there, so I won't really attempt to do that, but maybe just a couple of small observations, and I'll try to stick from the trust barometer rather than other points, but I thought there were a couple of really fascinating points there. Yeah, first and foremost, technology is a sector that there is some level of trust and enthusiasm for, right? So people have trust in technology. You look long term, there is trust in technology. I think, though, we are doing a disservice to the general population if we think that that's a, all-encompassing high level of trust in technology. And just to kind of pull out some strands within that where I think there is a bit more nuance in people's understanding of technology. First of all, as we know at the moment, that the majority of citizens have real concerns about information quality. These are concerns that have accelerated dramatically since the rise of social media, since the rise of paid social media and influencers, and those concerns have really, really increased over the COVID-19 period as well. So people are looking at, for example, information sources like media, social media, search media, and seeing, I don't trust that source of information, I can't navigate it, and they're not just then kind of turning away from it. Then if we kind of probe them further, what I would like to see is I would like to see the institutions playing their part in providing information quality. Now, we do very little, or starting to do more predictive research in the trust barometer at the moment. And one of the things we found last year is that you can get one of the largest trust gains you can realize as an institution or as a brand, I guess there's also Brand Netherlands, is by actually being a guardian of information quality. So I think we need to be careful not to frame the debate as people kind of running like lemmings enthusiastically towards technology and sensible people holding them back. I think people understand that trade-off. And I actually was really interested by your point around voting patterns. People know themselves they don't perhaps trust electronic voting better, but they're also busy. They also have other priorities in life, and they actually rather go to that too. So I think there is some nuance in that debate, and I think we should make sure we bring that into how we look at the topic as well.
And what I find very interesting and what you're also pointing towards is that if you look at the debate we've had the last couple of years, not only in the Netherlands, but in the whole world about social media and about the bubbles, there's a tendency to say to Facebook, to Twitter, you need to address this. Whereas in our pre-talk, we had the analogy about a knife-making company. So you make bread knives, and you sell bread knives to use to cut and smear your bread. And if somebody uses a bread knife to kill somebody, then we're not saying to the bread knife manufacturer, you should change your knife. We make a law saying it's illegal to kill somebody, and then we don't target the person who provides the means, but with the government we say what is proper use of a knife and what is improper use of a knife. Whereas with all this information technology, we've tend as a whole world to turn towards the people providing the means and say, you need to regulate this. But I don't want Facebook to regulate the political debate in the Netherlands, because Facebook is a company, Facebook has its own interests. I don't know whether those interests align with the Dutch society. So I want the Dutch government to do something about it, say this is allowable and this is not allowable, as we do with every other means, instead of saying this is now something that we want to outsource to the companies providing that, because I think that's really a bad way to go.
The question is, can you do that without the technical expertise or the knowledge? And this has been recurring from time to time. Is it enough to say to any party in the information space, these are the rules of like fair elections, fair information provision, or as in the case, for example, with the vaccine, in order to make sure that the vaccine is trustworthy, you need doctors who are able to run the randomized trials and the tests which actually verify the claims of a private company that that vaccine is effective and safe. To what extent you have to have that type of expertise that these companies already have in order to maintain that role that you're talking about also in the state's regulatory capacity.
Just like I could really imagine a future where fact-checking comes up to my mind, first of all, as something that could fit into that box. Maybe that's an area that also we need to be, if it becomes more important, maybe there needs to be a kind of professional standards, maybe there needs to be regulatory standards within a country on what is our point of view on even something as simple as fact-checking and moderation. So, yeah, I think there are some really interesting areas to think about. Perhaps where is the government letting us down? It might not be where we think, it might be in failing to regulate in a different way or to look at it in a different way as well. I think that's a really interesting point.
I think I like the taking things down to a level where you can really discuss them. So the comparison with a knife is great. At the same time, I think the point is, and that's particularly challenging for regulators, the topic is so dynamic. We don't know what technologies are going to be used for. But as a society and as a government, we do have a basic rule. We regulate people's behavior. We don't regulate technology. And I think that should be upfront. And yeah, the challenges are also well known. So these are border crossing topics where you have to deal with other cultures and countries that envision these kind of things in a very different manner. But that doesn't dispel you as a government from taking measures.
I agree with you. These technologies are so new. There are so many unknowns. These things are here now, these points of mistrust, but they will also be the next 10 years, the next 20 years. There are various examples in which everything seems to be perfectly planned and everything has thought about before and after. To name an example, in the 60s, when the NASA wanted to go to the moon, they first trialed with a hot air balloon to test that pressured suit with a guy. Everything went perfect. Every millisecond was planned perfectly for that astronaut to go down safely to the Earth. He landed in the sea, but when he fell down onto a level when he can breathe naturally, he opened his ventile, or how do you call it, the pressurized thing on his suit. But the moment when he came out of his shuttle, he fell down into the sea, which is normally no problem because the suit was waterproof and airproof. But the moment he opened that ventile, he drowned in his own water because of this. So everything was perfectly planned, everything ex ante exposed, every millisecond, but still there was this small thing which we cannot foresee, this unknown. And this will always be between us with new technologies. And so we don't have to be that harsh on new technology, I guess. It's a fact of experimenting and trying small things before we can actually implement them.
I do agree, but I also disagree, which is great for a debate, because, like with online, with internet voting, I mean, I think I had my first discussion on it in 2004, and the main thing you keep hearing is technology is changing so fast, and this is an international topic, and in every country where you discuss this, these are the arguments for governments not to do anything. And I think we're now 20 years later, and we still haven't done anything. We haven't really made proper standards, not on an international level, not on a national level. So we still have these companies that go to Africa and sell African countries new shiny technology that they don't need, that they don't have to use, that are dangerous for the trust that people have in their elections there. So yes, it's not something that the Dutch government can regulate between now and next year, but it's also a very easy argument not to do anything. And I think that is something that we really should try to address at some level.
I think that something maybe interesting to think about within that is also what are our expectations of Dutch government. And I said earlier, Netherlands is a high trust country and people have got over long term, you're right, reasonable levels of trust in government. It's very damaged over the last 12 months. But it's also a government which does spend a lot of its citizens' money, for example, by global standards. It's also a government in a very advanced economy, with a knowledge-based economy, in a very with quite some standing on the international stage. I think there's also something about a question: how far do you want to take it, and what do citizens have the right to expect? And to me, there's something that really strikes me about that. This is, I say this with much love as a foreigner living here, but it is a relatively regulated country. Like, there's quite a lot of rules. And then it suddenly comes to technology, and to be honest, it's quite laissez-faire. And, strong ideas about data privacy, great problems about criminality online, which is very much, compared to some other countries too. So there's quite some issues where I think there's almost a bit of a gap between how the country addresses the physical infrastructure and digital infrastructure, but I don't know if there's anything in that you could respond to.
No, but I'm curious about, you said the trust in the Netherlands dropped quite a bit last 12 months. Yeah. Did you find what were the prime reasons because of that?
Yeah, unfortunately, one of the things about Trust Barometer is it's a snapshot at a moment in time. So the great thing is we've got 21 years of kind of quantitative data. The bad thing is we don't have sort of deep dive into each market at each time what's happened. But what you have seen is that when institutions took proactive and quite assertive action to provide reassurance and safety around COVID-19 was a time that institution had a boost in trust. So I'm quite interested to see what happens over the next 6 months as we this kind of return to new normal, because the last field work for the Trust Barometer was done in the winter, which in the Netherlands, like in many countries at the time, people did not have much trust in the government response at that moment, and actually business had been relatively kind of more of a force for continuity perhaps in that period. So I think you may see that trust is regained, but one of the key factors, I think, is people not feeling that the government was acting to, provide security, reassurance, and protect economic and health and safety benefits as we got through the pandemic.
Yeah, I was curious. I mean, previously you mentioned indeed it's fallen back, but look at, I think, as a citizen, it's great that we are all prepared to subvent at the moment all those companies. I mean, we haven't had a real fallback in terms of unemployment. And, well, of course, many companies had to shut down or had to reinvent themselves. But, then say we have a loss of trust in our employers. I think there's a government behind it that has also supported an important basis for that. Or isn't that visible? Or
no, that is, I see the logic in that very strongly. So 2 points about that. One, I guess, kind of supports it. One really doesn't. But the one that supports it is, when we saw a gain in trust in government was exactly at that time that government was providing support, including substantial support. And Netherlands did very well at that time. A lot of extra trust in Dutch government and, of course, a very high level of support for the economy at that time. So that's great news, and that shows some connection to that. Unfortunately, the other side of that is in every market we surveyed other than one, there's much higher levels of trust in my employer as an institution. And in many of those countries, the government support was absent or a lot lower. So there's certainly not a correlation in that way, but I do sort of see something in the logic, and there's nothing that kind of directly contradicts it in the data either. Please go.
What I found really interesting happening now is that at first everybody was really happy with this very generous way of supporting businesses. And then a couple of stories of the media popped up saying, well, this business is getting the support, but it basically shouldn't. And then the immediate response again is by parliament, by citizens, that's our tax money, that's being spent illegal, it needs to be got back. And the only way we can do that is have a system that kind of compares to the system that was the cause for the kinderopvangtoeslag, where you have to have a lot of forms and a lot of information, and if you make one mistake, you don't get the money. So I think that is exactly the dynamic between the on the one hand, the expectation that the government is there for you and isn't like placing you in the corner of fraud. And on the other hand, we also want the government efficient and not spend our tax money on people that shouldn't get it. And I think that is such a fine balance. which is increased by the use of technological systems, because then we don't know anymore who's making the decisions. But I think that is one of the core issues that we're dealing with.
I think that's something around kind of sensitivity you mentioned earlier, that people have a very low tolerance for mistakes in any of these domains. And that is somehow quite connected to trust. I think it's also connected to the level of complexity of the debate that's able to be communicated in the ways that government has of communicating with citizens. So then I think it gets a bit probably into my kind of day job heartland of how do you communicate as well? Because was there any honest communication with citizens that a conscious choice was being made to quickly rush out this legislation and provide support to business? I mean, it's kind of perhaps there if you were following business news, but I would say if you were looking at mass media, it was not discussed at all at the time that we're deliberately, opening a kind of fire hose of support to protect the Dutch economy. By the way, remember later on that we did this when you see some people got it who didn't benefit. I'd rather that way. I think this is the right thing for the country. I missed that message totally. So I think there's something in being conscious of citizens' expectations and communicating in a way that can manage and balance those expectations.
Like the definition of infrastructure is that you don't notice it unless it breaks down, right? And this is what this discussion reminds me, is that also coupled with the fact that what you said, that trust is hard to gain and easy to lose, is that and what you said about the focus on certain scandals and forgetting about like everything else that works fine. That maybe where I see the tension maybe is the fact that while it might have been easier to walk back from, like, for example, electronic voting machines that said, okay, we tried it, okay, it wasn't a really good idea, we walk back, so we have a fallback plan, it's going to be fine. The breakdown of, not the government, but the breakdown of technology can, on the other hand, not just be like very pointed at certain scandals, but also have very widespread and severe consequences. So, and we see that in the US, that if a technology system breaks down, then it breaks down and it brings down millions of people at a time, because they serve millions of people at a time. And then it's very difficult to actually build up that system where such a momentary or exceptional breakdown doesn't destroys the trust in the otherwise well-functioning and invisible infrastructure. So that might be maybe I don't know if you agree, but maybe a way forward to think about like fail-safes in that sense of what happens when, like, what are the procedures which allow the experimentation that you have been talking about, but in a safe manner that allows acknowledgement of mistakes and the forgiveness of mistakes also from the government perspective. It's like, okay, we tried, it didn't work out, but we were able to manage the fallout or protect people from being really hurt. And I think the Tuxlagen affair was an exercise also in that, of how we walk back on a bad idea in a system.
Okay. Yeah, I think looking at this from that angle, I think there are so many mechanisms out there. We don't have to really reinvent a whole load of new policy measures. I think as a government, you have a well, I don't like the word toolkit, because that is as if you have things in your toolkit or instruments that only work for a specific period of time or a specific topic. I think very important is here that you have to realize there is already a lot of things out there, but we have to use them in a different way. So I think because it's often being, there are risks, but you don't know where the risks will operationalize. So one of the things you have to do is such an impact assessment. I think that is incredibly important. You have to invite people at the table that you haven't spoken to before. You don't just task a technician and say, hey, this is a problem, I want to solve it that way with this money, and you design a system for me. I mean, hello, there's so incredibly much, well, all value will be built in the technology. Yeah, unless you build things around it. But yeah, so I think we really have to reconsider the toolkit that we have and to get things in front before we start using things. And then we have documentation obligations in the GDPR, for instance. We can do logs, audit systems, monitoring, that kind of things. They will become increasingly important. And there's much more, but yeah.
Yes, partly I agree with you, but what I notice sometimes is that we tend to go in overdrive when we get disrupted by a sudden event or a sudden thing. Like we get political pressure, like solve this, and then we go in overdrive without thinking about possible outcomes afterwards, just to make sure the problem at that moment is gone, and the problems then. But that's the friction. We live in a democracy where we have people who represent ourselves in the Tweede Kamer, and when they say like, okay, fix this in this time of area, in this time, then we'll do it. And there is not always time to think about possible outcomes in the future or something whatsoever. Not always.
But what I found really interesting, I think if we're more open about risks up front, and that's something we see at the council, that with every piece of legislation there's an addendum that says what's in the legislation and why it's there and what are the benefits and everything. But they tend to be nowadays, even, I think it has a little bit to do with the political climate. I've been working there for 11 years, so I can look back a little bit. With all the parties and the very tight majorities in both houses, if they have a majority in both houses, these pieces of description tend to be more sales documents now than an actual honest guidance for a good decision-making process in the parliament. And that's something we said multiple times in our jaarverslagen, but also in the advice about digitalization. If you're really upfront before about risks and possible outcomes that you don't want, then you take Parliament with you in that journey, and then not to say afterwards, "Oh, I told you so," but then you might navigate a little bit of that political outcry that comes with an incident, and at least they're a part of the decision-making process, and it's not swept under the table in the beginning in the hopes that it won't pop up.
Yeah, to add on that, what I often miss in discussions nowadays is people aren't departing from or talking from, this is our vision. And here we have a totally unexpected problem we cannot solve in a minute. We have to solve it because we are responsible. But what I miss then is mentioning where the problem sits in the spectrum of the vision. And we know, we have an MP who says vision is a problem of your eyes. Yeah, if you start from that, where do you go with your technology and how you apply it? And of course, so if you know where it sits in the vision, you can discuss with people. You're not discussing technology only. That's really a problem I have.
We slowly want to, we have to wrap up because time is running. But like, I would like to, I don't want to stop this discussion in its track because it's getting super interesting. So one way of continuing this discussion, I think, is to actually try to structure discussions that happen in all corners of academia, certainly, but also I see in all different places of and corners of government and also on the market about these issues. And one of the ambitions maybe of this project and also of us at the university is to structure these discussions into a coherent agenda, at least to know what kind of questions we need to ask and try to answer to get a better understanding of how things are playing out, what are the dynamics, what are the alternatives that we face. So what I would like to ask from you as a closing is like, there have been many questions raised. What would you put on a trust agenda, research agenda, if you like, that you would want to have some kind of an attention being paid to by a coalition of practitioners, private citizens, academics, public servants, businesses, what would be the issue that or question that you would want to see in this in such a document? And I will start because for me that was already a relative discussion. What I've learned today was that the NASA model of impact assessment and planning maybe is not the best suited for an environment where there are too many unknown unknowns. Right, you cannot plan for everything, and I've learned that from you and also from the interaction between Helen and Shem that maybe impact assessment is necessary, but it can take us so far as we see in the domain of known unknowns, and when there are lots of unknown unknowns, as is the case with many of the digital technologies, then we have to have another form of governance also ready, standing by, which is able to deal with the damage, the potential incidents, and respond to that with the speed and efficiency and trustworthiness that a crisis requires. And when a dam breaks, then you don't start parliamentary inquiries, you start saving people, right? And dam is another technology to keep people dry and safe. And in that sense, there is also institutional knowledge of how to deal with such crises and incidents. But as Stephen has pointed out, somehow we are more confident in planning for such contingencies in the physical infrastructure, but not that much in the digital infrastructure. And maybe that's something that we can actually think about. What is the best crisis response when it's not the dam that breaks down, but our information environment or our educational environment or something else that is much more immaterial and lies somewhere in the cloud. So that would be my mental note, and please add yours if you have.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think the problem I have now is it's kind of frighteningly similar, which is I would really like to explore that further. What is the appetite for regulation, and what is the appetite for kind of a stable and structured society when it comes to the digital economy, when it comes to digital services, when it comes to digital government? I'm not really sure that there is a sort of single view. I don't think any of us really landed on a kind of concrete view on what our expectations are, what the expectations on us to deliver that kind of environment to people. You know, we sort of have a rough idea that people want to live in a safe environment. They want to have opportunity. We have a lot of these sort of fixtures in life, but I wonder what fixtures we do have around the digital world. So I really commend this effort to try to understand what voters want in terms of digital voting mechanisms. I think if you apply that line of reasoning to many other topics here, I'd be curious to see where we get to. You know, what are the expectations of Dutch government to provide that sort of safe environment? To what degree do people want shortcuts and they want things faster and they don't really care about some casualties on the road when it comes to technology? In which areas is that a complete no-go and they absolutely cannot countenance, you know, any mistakes or any citizen who's disadvantaged by a particular technology? And also, I guess, connected to that, how can we bring a semblance of reality into that picture too, knowing that also manual administration will also make mistakes. There will also be limited opportunity to deliver impact to a smaller number of people if we don't leverage some of these technologies. There also may be issues around competitiveness, and also may be issues around interoperability with neighbours nearby and far away. So I think just understanding more about expectations of society and how to meet them would be a really good point of departure for me.
Thank you. Linton?
I would be really curious to see how we can combine the legislative process where we want to include Parliament and want to have those debates on the values and what we expect from our government in such a way that the technology questions do not end up always on the pile of technological issues that are the last resort because of the speed in which they're changing. So that would be something that would be, I think, of interest, combined with what Elaine said, the technology should not be upfront. So just getting the IT people earlier at the table, which is something that is said nowadays a lot, even by us, is not maybe the right solution for this, but I'm not sure what the best solution would be otherwise. So how do you manage that process with inclusion of the technology and the knowledge that you need without it dominating the whole debate that you need to have?
I would be very curious to see some more research or thought about where this equilibrium is for public servants like us on these kind of new technologies and how we proceed with them. Like now we are making policies, we're making tools, we're making new legislation, but how would they like to be informed about it? Like afterwards, after we have done the research and built the tools, or like would they be more into a process which they are upfront more into this thought of us? So where is this equilibrium? Like, would they like to see more engagement at the beginning before we start implementing this kind of new technologies or experimenting, or is it more like just do it and be transparent with it afterwards what you did? So I'm looking for that equilibrium. Where is it? And that makes me very curious. Because that gives us reasons to move on or whatsoever.
Yeah, thanks. I definitely understand that that finding the right time and spot to regulate, that's an incredible challenge for any government, and where many governments are competing with each other on the market, or their commercial parties in the country, they are competing on the market. I think these discussions definitely have to also be brought to the European Union level, I think. Very often, when you see a problem, you look at the problem and you forget about, again, the ecosystem around it. And I think very often solutions don't lie in the center of the problem; they're around the problem, and you have to make new connections. You have to connect existing instruments with each other. And of course, an impact assessment there's no silver bullet in this whole discussion. There's a lot of bullets, and you have to polish them, and maybe altogether they get a shiny, sort of silverish thing that can make a certain technology in a certain context perhaps trustworthy. And you have to convince people, you have to go towards them, you have to invite them at tables. I know that the Ministry of the Interior has done that, I think 2 years ago. They invited people selected from all kinds of groups in society to discuss, hey, what is technology doing with our fundamental rights? We had to explain them what are fundamental rights. What rights do you have? And what does technology do to them? And then you engage with those people into a discussion. So I think there's very much work to do. Particularly also for government, even where all those people are doing their utmost to make things work. It has been said, 95% goes well, and it is indeed true. As long as things are seamless and unobtrusive, they work. But with this technology, it might work as well, but in the end, it might be very damaging. So you have to keep on explaining what you are doing and make things reviewable. I'm not such a fan any longer of making things transparent. I find that a problematic concept, because transparent for who, at what point, about what, and then do I leave the decision whether something is responsible to use? Do I leave it to the individual? And do we have to make every individual an expert in technology? I don't think so. We let people live their life. They're way too busy. We shouldn't responsibilize those people with all kinds of rights and obligations. We should leave them live their lives and say, as government, our aim should be to make it work in a responsible way and do that in a seamless way as far as possible. So that's a lot, but I really find it important to zoom out in these discussions and not to focus on technology only. It's always about the context. and it's always about how people deal with it. And we have to, maybe we have to identify some areas where we see the most emerging issues or the most urgent issues coming up. Yeah, I can think of a couple, but I'm really curious about where things go well. We can learn from that, and where things don't go so well. And I think sometimes looking at where things go wrong might be extremely worthy to look at for how we can improve things, and vice versa. So looking at, for instance, biases in technology, they can be extremely well used for combating discrimination, because you know where the discrimination problems sit. And that can be done with many more things. So we have to be creative thinkers.
Thank you very much. Usually when discussions end with "we need more discussion," that's a not very inspiring conclusion, but we are in the Netherlands, and my experience living here is that there are lively societal discussions, and people are super willing and able to engage, including not just ordinary citizens or members of the business community, but also civil servants, public officials. With that, I would like to thank you for joining this discussion. I hope that we will have the chance to continue that. I would like to ask or thank SPAU 25 for hosting this discussion, and hopefully we'll be able to continue this discussion maybe here as well. And I would like to also thank the audience for joining in. I'm really sorry that we couldn't provide an inroads into this discussion with questions and chat, but hopefully we'll meet sometime in person, and then we can continue this live. Thank you again. This was, at least for me, a super nice and useful experience. See you maybe sooner than anyone of us would expect. Thank you very much.